Great. So thanks for joining us today for a second interview for the Northern Forum of Imagination. And we are doing this now in conjunction with the Junkyard of the Mind. Today we have Magdalena Balcerak Jackson with us. Thank you so much for joining us, Magdalena.
Thank you.
So Magdalena is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Miami. Her research focuses on the nature, the epistemic powers, and the value of various capacities of the human mind. In particular, she focuses on the imagination, reasoning, perception, and linguistic understanding. What I really like about Magdalena's work is that she focuses on combining work in different areas of philosophy, which are often kept separate, and she aims to solve problems that are relevant to our individual and social lives by combining these diverse areas. So she combines work, for example, in epistemology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, aesthetics, and philosophy of science. But today we're going to focus on her work on the imagination. So Magdalena, what first got you thinking philosophically about the imagination?
Okay, so there is actually an official story that I thought was true for a long time, and a story I realized was actually true. So I started working on philosophical methodology, especially on thought experiments and all kinds of what-if thinking. And of course, it was kind of natural to start thinking about what mental states we are exactly in when we ask the questions, what if? So that is what I thought was the reason why I got so interested in the imagination. But the more I actually worked on imagination, the more I realized that imagination was connected to a lot of puzzles that I was always interested in, but kind of didn't allow myself to think about because I thought that they lead too far out from my actual area of studies. So I realized that it relates to issues about literature that I was interested in. I also have an MA in literature, to a problem about moral inertia that I'm really interested in, to issues about what exactly it means for mental states to be subjective or perspectival, to issues about autonomy in life planning, or even to issues about creating utopias. And so I really realized that I was actually thinking about all those things, and that when I would be working on the imagination, it was kind of okay, and that imagination was related to all those different puzzles that seem disconnected. So the book that I'm writing right now is a book that very much explores the role of imagination across different areas of the kind of cognitive and life projects that we are engaged in our daily lives, individually as well as socially.
Great. So I, see that you're working on the imagination, and that's really fascinating. And a lot of people talk about the imagination and often seem to be talking about different things. Some people talk about imagination in really creative contexts, and other people talk about the imagination in a sort of epistemic context, as you do. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you take imagination to be, and how do you think it differs from related notions, such as supposing or conceiving? You've worked on reasoning quite a lot, as you said. So how does your work on imagination connect to your work on reasoning?
Okay, thank you. So I think that there is certain types of distinctions that are very commonly made at the very beginning of discussions of imagination, such as the distinction between sensory and imagination on one side. This is something that I know Robert Hopkins was talking about last time, and propositional imagination on the other side. It's also the distinction between the creative imagination, what artists and writers engage in when they create alternative universes, characters, and stories, and what people have sometimes called recreative or simulationist imagination. And I guess I realized that I believe that those distinctions aren't very helpful, and that they obstruct the real role of imagination more than they help to elucidate it. And so the way I think about imagination is going to have a certain relationship to the kind of recreativist or simulationist tradition, but it's going to be a bit different. So here's the main idea. I think that imagination is our ability to produce representations of how things look, sound, feel, how they also affect us, whether emotionally or morally or maybe aesthetically. And it's the ability to produce those representations absent of any input from our external environment at that time. Plus, it's our ability also to produce representations that are in some sense under our control. The sense in which I think they are under our control is not that we can always decide when to start imagining, but that at least once we form a certain imagination, it is up to us to modify it. Okay, so when I imagine seeing a certain flower, it is up to me, for example, to decide which color the flower should have, whether I should maybe add another flower together to the first flower I imagined. So that kind of ability to play around with it, to modify the imagination, is the kind of control that I'm interested in. So overall, I think that what imagination gives us access to are what I now like to call essentially experiential properties. So I take it the case that there are features of the world which we have access to in virtue of being conscious beings, and also in virtue of being beings who in some sense have an understanding of different kinds of value, for which things aren't merely there, but which are in some sense affected by things. And those are exactly the properties that I think imagination represents. The sensory properties like the looks, the sounds, maybe the bodily sensations, but then also properties that I think, and that's why I reject the distinction, that aren't really well captured by the sensory account. Properties like affective properties, which I don't think are just emotions, but for example, also things like reactive attitudes, that a certain situation strikes us as morally repugnant. I take this to be an essentially experiential property, a property that we perceive in the world because we are conscious being that in some sense perceive things as being valuable or significant in certain sort of ways. That is the kind of general idea. It's in some sense sensory imagination plus, okay? And because I think that the core case of imagination is the case in which we are involved in an active process of creating a rather complex, multimodal representation of a certain scenario or a situation with those kinds of properties, with the way things look and sound and feel and affect us. That's why I think that it is really, really important to understand that for that, we do not merely use our familiarity or acquaintance with the sensory properties that we acquire by in virtue of being perceivers, but we also use our creativity. And so I think that it is simply not helpful to leave the creative aspect out of the imagination. So that's maybe the general idea. And of course, once you get this general idea, you very quickly realize about how there are other ways to think about non-actual scenarios, about mere possibilities that do not represent the world as being kind of full of those essentially experiential features, but just, you know, maybe because you want to assume certain things as true for a specific purpose, maybe for the purpose of engaging in kind of fairly abstract what if reasoning. And that's what I think supposition does for us. So what I think supposition is the representation of a certain non-actual hypothetical situation. We accept it as true in the Stolnaker sense of acceptance for a specific purpose. And that specific purpose is typically the purpose of reasoning through the consequences of that supposition. Now, the fact that I mentioned reasoning here and I didn't mention reasoning in the imagination case is kind of, you might think, doesn't play that much of a role, because when you realize about how I described the core case of imagination, the case in which we are actively engaged in building up out of simple parts this complex multimodal representation of a hypothetical situation, then I of course think that that process by itself is a process that is non-arbitrary, that is guided by certain norms, and that can by itself be described as a certain form of reasoning. So I think one of the non-traditional features of my account is that core cases of the imagination, the kind of effortful cognitive activity that we engage in before we reach a certain representation of those complex scenarios, that this kind of activity should be viewed as a very specific and peculiar form of reasoning itself.
Great. So just to clarify, you mentioned at the beginning a difference between sensory imagination and propositional imagination. So from what I gather, it seems like your view would be more in favor of viewing imagination as sensory or experiential in nature, right? So do you think that it's possible to imagine propositionally, or is that something that doesn't play as much a role in your work, and why?
Yeah, so I think that there is one way in which people talk about propositional imagination, where I think this is just what I mean when I talk about supposition. And I don't want to tell people how to talk, but I think it would be more useful if we reserve the term supposition for this kind of way of representing hypothetical scenarios that doesn't put any demands on the ways in which we represent them. I think that what makes imagination what it is that we represent the hypothetical scenario in a very specific way. And that very specific way is we represent it as it presents ourselves to us as the subject of experience. And that is, in the ways that involve certainly sensory properties, the ways things look and sound and feel, but also, and this is what's not captured by the sensory imagination, how it presents to itself to us as in affective ways. Either in terms of how we emotionally react to things, but also how we kind of maybe react to it with our basic moral sense or aesthetic sense, whatever people might think goes into the kind of reactive attitude umbrella term that I think has something in common with the sensory properties. If you want to use a term that I think would be the most fitting one from the philosophy of mind, I'm interested in the phenomenal properties of the world. I use the word experiential because I think it's a more natural term, and I don't want only philosophers to read the book. But if you want to relate to the discussions in the philosophy of mind, I'm really interested in the phenomenal imagination. Maybe that would be the term that I could use as well.
Great. Yeah. So in how it feels like,
Yeah.
in a sense, for people who are not familiar with philosophy of mind. Good. So I think that should clarify quite well what you take imagination to be. In your work, you try to convince people that imagination can justify. So can you explain a little bit how imagination can justify on your view, despite being, as you said, up to us? So as you said, people often use imagination to make things up. How can this sometimes lead, or often leads, to true beliefs, or to beliefs that are likely to be true, to good beliefs?
Yeah. So I think it's actually really important to have a foundational story here that is consistent with the best empirical information that we have about imagination right now. So it is really important to me in the way I work on the imagination is that I don't describe a cognitive capacity that I wish we would have, that would be awesome to have. I do try to describe a cognitive capacity that I think we do have, and we have empirical reason belief we do have. So what the empirical research has shown is that when it comes to the functioning of our human mind, the capacities that typically make us acquainted with sensory properties, for example, like our perceptual capacity, that imagination of the same kinds of properties, so visual imagination, for example, that they are closely tied to the capacity to actually visually perceive. And I think that that is the core that is true about the kind of simulationist picture. I do think that it is probably a good empirical hypothesis that the main function of the imagination is to represent the types of features and properties that we are familiar with from our perception. So that the function is in some sense to recreate whatever we could also potentially perceive. This is just, I'm kind of focusing on the visual way because I think it's quite easy to kind of generalize that. And so if it is true that we acquire our capacity to imagine, partly parasitic on having a capacity to perceive, and partly parasitic on having, in some sense, collected a certain kind of basic stock of building blocks, like by seeing things that are red, seeing things that are round, seeing things that are textured in a kind of smooth sort of way and storing them up, whether in conceptual or non-conceptual ways. We acquire this basic stock of perceptual building blocks that we can then reuse in imagination and recombine to form images when we want to talk about the visual kind that of course don't correspond to anything in the actual external environment, but that do correspond to something that in principle could exist in the external environment. Why? Well, because it is composed out of the relevant building blocks. So the idea is that imagination can justify us because it is constrained in systematic ways. For example, visual imagination is constrained in systematic ways by those kinds of features that make perception what it is, but those kind of features that form certain types of regularities or maybe even laws of perception. And those kinds of features make sure that we can't really imagine just about anything, but we can only imagine things that are consistent with those kind of generalities of features of perception. So let me give you an example. It's a very old philosophical example of a synthetic a priori truth that we can't imagine something that is red all over and green all over at the same time. I think it's true that we can't do that. And I think that the explanation about why we can't imagine that is that it's just a feature of perception that makes it impossible to have sensory awareness of those two colors as being instantiated in the same space. So that's the basic story. The basic story is that imagination on the very foundational sense justifies us about certain general or structural claims that express something like generalities or laws of our experience. I've explained it now with respect to visual imagination, but you can easily also imagine now, for example, how other modalities of experience, other modalities of sensory experience, but also, for example, things like emotion might be governed by those kind of general structural features. And so I think that that's the basic justificatory story. Now, I think that the story is not everything that imagination does for us. I think that that story is important to tell because that story is important to give us an answer to the skeptical problem. But I think what imagination really does most fundamentally, it provides you understanding of how it would be like to be a subject of certain scenarios or situations. So it provides you this essentially experiential information. And once you start thinking about why we would care about this kind of information, you realize we care about it for really fundamental purposes in our lives. So when I try to decide what to do, I care about how things are going to be like for me when I decide to take option A, whether option B. When I try to treat someone else decently, I care about how it is like for them to be in the spot they are in. When I try to imagine about how to set up certain basic structures of society, I care how it's going to be like for people in different circumstances to be where they are. So this kind of making comprehensible or understandable in ways that I think can't be done in ways that are purely discursive or that don't involve this essentially experiential ways, this kind of ways of making comprehensible how it would be like to be in a certain spot. I think that kind of work to create that understanding, that's what I think now of as the most important epistemic role of the imagination. If you want, it's a certain information, how it would be like, a how explanation. How can it be, right? So maybe you kind of allow me to kind of make one analogy, what I think is really, really helpful. So when people say that works of fiction give us interesting knowledge, they try to explain how this happened. Now, think about a book like maybe Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, which is to a large extent about someone who murders someone else. And it's about their very complicated psychological life that is at the outset really hard to understand, right? So now compare a situation in which you go on Wikipedia and you look up the kind of summary, the bare bones summary of Crime and Punishment. And you read that you have this guy, Raskolnikov, and he murders someone, and then he feels really sorry for himself in some ways, right? Now, you might think, okay, so it's possible to murder someone, feel really sorry for yourself. It still seems like a really puzzling thing. So what Crime and Punishment does for you is by putting you in the position of creating a certain really detailed and rich and experiential imagination of that scenario, and of that person, Raskolnikov, and his inner life that involves feeling quite sorry for himself after murdering someone. I think this is also a case where imagination gives you exactly this. It doesn't just give you this abstract idea that someone could feel that way after having done that. No, it gives you the understanding of a way that that could actually be so, an understanding of how someone could feel that way after having done something like that.
Great. So imagination can justify beliefs from a first person perspective and give you that kind of insight. That's really, really interesting. But some people might still be skeptical about the power of the imagination to justify. Is imagination always a reliable capacity to yield good beliefs in your view? What are the limitations of your view? Can you tell us a little bit more about whether any imagining can justify any belief, or whether there are kinds of cases in which imagination won't really work to justify beliefs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there is one piece of news that I take to be bad news for those people who got interested in imagination coming from the philosophical methodology angle, like I was at the beginning. So I do think that what people were hoping for is that there would be a good story about how imagination can justify us in believing certain kind of high value metaphysical claims. For example, I think many people believe that it is imagination that justifies us in believing about the possibility of philosophical zombies, which are important to argue for the claim that physicalism about mental state is false. And I think that imagination can't do that. And I think the reason why imagination can't do that is because people are simply wrong about the type of contents that imaginings can have. So if you agree with a type of story on which what imagination basically does, it has the storage of basic building blocks, like the basic experiential features of the world, the various ways things can look, shape-wise, color-wise, the way things can sound, the different types of emotions people can have. And if the feature, so this kind of phenomenal features of the world, they're essentially experiential features. And if imagination really is the capacity to play around in useful ways with those basic building blocks, then imagining is never going to inform us about anything like the essences of things or the hidden empirical natures of things. So because imaginings won't have those contents, they're of course also not going to justify you in any claims like that. Now, that's not that to say that there is no actually metaphysical claim about reality that can be justified by imagination, but it won't be those claims that philosophers were interested in for a very long time. I don't believe that's possible. Maybe there is some other capacity that can do that. Maybe there's conceiving, maybe there's intuition. I think the problem with those capacities is not that we can't have a coherent picture about how conceiving could do it. I think we just don't have this capacity psychologically. So that's the bad news. The good news, I think, is that the other kind of worries about imagination, the worries that have to do with reliability, I think that those worries are overblown. And I think that they are partially overblown because people have gotten so used to connecting the imagination or to comparing the imagination to perception. And I think that if anything, imagination in the core instances is much more like reasoning than like perception. So here is why this would be important. Perception is a capacity that we have that is fairly evenly distributed across the population. Of course, with some exemptions. But overall, we pretty much perceive the same kinds of features. Of course, some of us are better than others, but the differences aren't that huge, right? And there's also a very limited sense in which we can train ourselves to become better perceivers. There isn't that much that we can really do. And so if you have a capacity like that you can't influence very much, and that we all basically have to, in some sense, the same extent, we should care about we are reliable perceivers or not, right? Because we can't make ourselves much more reliable perceivers if we happen to get a negative answer. But there's other capacities that we have, such as the capacity, for example, for certain forms of abstract reasoning, like mathematical reasoning. I mean, nobody would go around and test how reliable people are at mathematical reasoning because we know the answer. Like, we suck at mathematical reasoning, right? But that's not a reason to kind of despair and to say that we should stop doing mathematics. Why isn't this a reason? Well, there are two reasons for that. One reason is that there are actually people who are good mathematical reasoners, and we have good reasons to accept the types of beliefs that are justified by the mathematical reasoning capacities of those reasoners. And they don't actually need to use anything but the mathematical reasoning capacities to come to be justified in those beliefs. And the second feature is that it's a highly trainable capacity. It's something like a skill where it makes sense to actually put a lot of effort into acquiring that skill and honing that skill. And now I believe that imagination really is more like the mathematical reasoning thing than like the perception thing. I think we have good empirical reason to believe that our imagining capacity comes in so some people are really good imaginers visually, some people are really bad imaginers visually. As you probably know, some people don't have any visual imagination whatsoever, and this doesn't mean that they can't think about hypothetical scenarios. It just means that they don't do it in the visual sort of way. And so any kind of dimension of imagination, you see a lot of variability. And we also have more and more evidence that different types of imagination are highly trainable. So only recently, some people got really skeptical about empathy. Paul Bloom wrote a whole book about how we should not make any judgments about how to treat people, any moral judgments by using our empathy, because we are just so bad at empathizing. There is the egocentric bias and so on. And now there is more and more work showing up, among other things, by Zaki, Stanford and Berkeley psychology, that actually shows that that is true as a general claim about us. But it turns out that empathy is also highly trainable. So actually, one of the funniest studies that he did is there is this basic test where people look at faces of people and are supposed to simply identify the emotion. And there is the basic empirical result that shows that women are quite a lot better at it than men. They actually repeated this study just by giving the men a financial incentive to get it right. And so merely the financial incentive already significantly raised the performance of the male participants in the study, which basically again shows that a certain kind of carefulness and effort probably plays a big role in the specific ability. Now, I think that empathy is one type of imagination. It has to do with imagining how it is like to be in some sense in the emotional shoes of someone else. But I do think that those kinds of empirical results are part of the type of evidence that shows me that we should not discredit it too easily on grounds of statistical reliability, but rather focus on understanding who the experts are and how to make ourselves better imaginers.
Great. So in your view, we should be skeptical of everyone's ability to imagine well, but we can still trust some people who have really worked on their capacity to imagine, to produce reliable beliefs. Good.
Yes, and I do believe that we also have good reason to invest into our own capacity of the imagination, simply because I think for some types of insights, there just isn't any alternative. I don't think that there is much alternative for certain types of decisions that involve other people, for example. I think that the type of information we get by putting themselves in their emotional shoes, so to speak, that's information that is very hard to get in any other way.
Great. So I was just about to ask you this question. How do you think that imagination helps us make decisions? And, can you say a little bit more about why you think that nothing else can play that role in these kinds of cases that you mentioned?
Okay, so I think that for very many different decisions, whether a decision is good, a practical decision is good, very often depends on how it is like to be in a certain spot. So for example, if I make a decision about which kind of ice cream to buy at the ice cream shop, I care how the ice cream is going to taste like. And I care that taste, the way that the ice cream is going to taste like, is a taste I like. So those are the two kinds of features of imagination that I care about. The sensory feature, which specific taste am I going to experience? And the kind of more affective feature. Is the taste I'm going to experience a taste that I like? Is this going to affect me in positive ways, which is of course what I want when I make practical decisions. So I think that there is only two sources of this kind of information. There's actual experience. So I could be one of those people who tries to get a scoop out of every possible ice cream. I'm German, so I'm definitely not one of those people. So the only option I have is somehow try to use my knowledge of the different tastes that are combined in the ice cream shop. For example, if the ice cream shop is offering me a chili and chocolate ice cream, then even if I had never had a chili and chocolate ice cream, I of course had a lot of chocolate. I also know how chili tastes like. And I do think I have the ability, a kind of decent gustatory imagination, which can give me some idea about the taste that I'm likely going to experience when I choose that sort of ice cream. And so given that I can't, make my way through all the ice creams, that's the capacity that I'm going to use. Now, given that those affective components, like what I like, is highly subjective, asking you about the ice cream is likely not going to give me the answer that I want, because, unless I know that for whatever reason we have a very similar taste, asking you whether you like the ice cream or not is typically not really going to cut it for me. So this is, of course, a low stakes case, right? This is a case in which, so what if I'm wrong? Well, I wasted a bunch of money on an ice cream that I didn't like. But there's a lot of high stakes situations for which we also care about this essentially experiential information, where we also don't really have any possibility to experiment, to actually have those experiences. So when I make decisions about the career to choose, or when I make decisions about where to live, like let's assume I'm German, I used to live in Germany, I got this job offer to go to Miami, a place very, very different from Germany. And now let's just assume that the decision is just where to live. Let's assume that the job doesn't play any role here. Now, of course, what I want to do is I want to have a life that feels valuable and significant and good for me, right? So I'm going to try to imagine how my life is going to be like when I try to make the decision about whether to stay in Germany or whether to move to the US. And again, here we're just using this capacity of imagination. Now, the case is high stakes, but the case is also highly, much more difficult, right? Now, we are not merely imagining one specific kind of experience. We are imagining a whole complex of experiences over time. And yet, I do think that we use our imagination to make those decisions. I do think that we get some information about the experiential features of this situation for us when we make those decisions. And I think that the nice feature, and here is maybe something that is often underappreciated, is that when I engage in this decision about should I stay in Germany or should I move to the US, there is obviously, there is nothing to judge my imagination against, simply because it's about the future. It didn't happen, right? So there is no sense in which what I imagine is at this point correct or incorrect. It's not like about the ice cream, right? The ice cream is right there. So it's about the future. So in some sense, I'm not merely trying to get it right, because there is no right yet. And actually, in addition to that, a lot of the ways in which that matter for how my life is going to be like are going to depend on further decisions that I'm going to make once I choose a certain path. So when I imagine how it's going to be like for me to live in the US, there isn't a specific picture that I'm trying to kind of simulate and get right. No, I'm kind of assembling a certain way of life. I'm really planning a certain way of life. And I'm constantly asking myself, would this be a path that I am willing to choose and to commit to? So in some sense, I am creatively engaged in a kind of life planning process. And I am very well aware that that process is gonna be in some sense up to me. So in a weird sort of way, whether I'm gonna be right, whether I'm gonna be really happy, partly is gonna depend on the decision that I'm gonna take on the path of getting somewhere, right? So the weird way is that being creative here and not merely thinking of this as trying to get it right about a fixed future, the way in which I allow myself to be creative, I think is a way to make it more likely that I am going to design a future that I can be happy with at the end.
Nice. So imagination can help us to make decisions by, on the one hand, giving us some insight into what the future might be like, but also by committing us to taking the right actions in our life to make the future the way we want it to be. That's a very nice way to express that. Thank you. So that sounds really, really exciting. And do you think that imagination plays a role not just in our individual lives, but also in our collective lives when it comes to decision making? Do you think that there's a role with respect to policy making, for example? What's the collective or social role of the imagination that you think we should be focusing on?
Yeah, so I actually think that this is a really, really important topic. This is the last chapter of the book. And this is the chapter I'm most struggling with, because it's something that very few people from the philosophical literature on the imagination and philosophy of mind and epistemology have really ventured there. And it's a very different type of philosophical tradition, and it's a very different type of literature that's relevant for this sort of questions. But there's one thought that convinced me to write about it at all. And that's the thought about utopias. So a while ago, there was a tradition to create utopias as those imagined perfect alternative worlds. And for a very long time, people did think of utopias as something like guiding ideals, as something like this is something which we should try to achieve. And then something happened. And I think people decided that to create utopias is somehow naive, is to engage in a kind of dreaming that is just completely oblivious to the messy and dark and dirty reality. And so I started asking myself whether that's really true, because I think that there is something to the social imagination of a state that is better than what we have that is useful. And here is the kind of thought that I'm trying to explore. And this is really the only chapter where my own thinking is still very much in flux. The idea is the following, and actually it comes, I'm going to give you an analogy from a different area to understand it. So in literary theory, people try to understand when something is fictional. Like, what exactly creates fictional engagement? And one interesting way to get at fictional engagement is by looking at ways in which people break fictional engagement. So metafiction, for example, is a type of fiction that involves the systematic playing around with fictional engagement. For example, by directly talking to the reader. As the author, I'm in some sense disturbing this immersive fantasy that the reader is engaging in the story. And this is something that I explored when I did my master in literature. I think there is a good way, if you understand how fiction can be broken, you understand what fiction does to you. And so I have the same idea about utopias. I think that there is a value if you understand why a certain feature of society is not merely not accurate, but utopic. That means it's not even within easy reach of us. You can learn quite a lot about the most important features of society that need our work. So I'm trying to make an argument that by understanding utopias, not directly as those things that guide us where to go, but as in some sense weird mirrors that show us what's really broken, we can revive a certain use of the social imagination. We can try to uncover what is maybe most far from perfect by thinking about idealized social structures. So that's one way, and maybe I'm going to kind of stop it there, because that's definitely the type of aspect that I am least confident about in the specific chapter. And I am also kind of most curious about hearing what other people would say about it.
That sounds really exciting. I'm a big fan of utopias and dystopias, like Black Mirror episodes that I watch in binge. So I'm really excited to read about your thoughts on that when the book comes out. Can you tell us a little bit more about the rest of the book? That's the last question I'll ask you today. But we've talked about the epistemology of the imagination, its role in decision making. Can you tell us about other chapters that you've been working on, and what parts you have enjoyed writing the most, and maybe which chapters you think will be most exciting to everyone viewing this video and maybe reading the book when it comes out?
Yeah, so the book in some sense has two parts. One of the part is more the foundational part when I say about what imagination is, how imagination gives you understanding of those essentially experiential features of the world. And then the book really goes into different types of cognitive projects that use the imagination in crucial ways. So I talk about understanding literature. I talk about trying to find out how to treat other people well. I talk about making decisions, and I talk about the social aspect. So at the beginning, I was not expecting to go into so many different areas, but it really came quite naturally. The better I understood what imagination really is and the potential it has, the more I found myself simply not being able to put down some of those other thoughts. And one thing that I have developed along with it is maybe a kind of guiding metaphor for the book. So another thing I have been always fascinated with is the figure of a court jester. And a court jester is this kind of figure that superficially is there to amuse people and to make jokes, that superficially is supposed to be someone who is a fool or maybe even stupid. But when you look into the history of court jesters, you often find that the court jester, at least in some cases, was also an important advisor to the king. And the court jester was important advisor to the king only because this kind of superficial joking nature made it possible for the court jester to offer critical advice to the king that the king would not have otherwise accepted. And so I like to think about the imagination as like the court gesture of the mind. It's something that has this kind of playful and creative and seemingly innocent or maybe even kind of anti-epistemic nature. But when you really look deep into it, and when you in some sense give it the listening it deserves, it turns out to be like a really important advisor. So that's something that has become kind of really an important metaphor for me to think about what imagination is and what it does for us. And so it's going to be a little bit about a book like, look, here is this really seemingly frivolous cognitive capacity of the human mind. And even in the frivolity, it can give you really foundational and fundamental insights into all kinds of aspects of our lives.
Great, great. That sounds really exciting. And I like that you acknowledge the playfulness of the imagination and still show why we should value it. So I'm really looking forward to reading the book when it comes out. And thanks so much for doing this interview with me today and for the Junkyard of the Mind and the Modern Imagination Forum. I know it's sometimes a little bit daunting to talk about work in progress as your ideas keep evolving as you write, but I've really enjoyed this conversation with you. So thank you, Magdalena.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it as well.